My parents called me a stain on our legacy because I chose old paper over new money. At my grandmother's 90th birthday, right in front of 200 guests, they forced her to cut me out of the will to fund my sister's failing startup. They smirked as she signed, thinking they had won billions. But they forgot she survived the Great Depression. That document wasn't my end. It was a trap worth exactly $1. My name is Alara Vance. Most people in San Francisco know my family name from the society pages or the tech blogs, usually accompanied by headlines screaming about innovation, disruption, or the occasional gala lawsuit. But nobody knows me. I am the ghost in the machine, the glitch in the glossy, high-definition programming of the Vance dynasty. While my sister was out pitching vaporware to angel investors, I was usually found in a basement apartment in the Mission District that smelled of mold and binding glue, trying to save words that had been written 300 years ago. The air in my studio was thick with dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light that pierced through the street-level window. I held my breath, my hands steady as a surgeon's, applying a microscopic dab of wheat starch paste to the spine of a King James Bible printed in the 17th century. This was my reality. It was a world of tactile silence, where value was determined by history and preservation, not by stock options or quarterly projections. To my father, Richard, and my mother, Beatrice, I was not a historian or a conservator. I was a scavenger, a failure who liked to play with trash while the real adults made the world turn. My phone buzzed against the workbench, the vibration threatening to knock over a vial of ethanol. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The notification had a specific, demanding rhythm. It was a summons. It was the day of the event. My grandmother, Eleanor Vance, was turning 90. I carefully covered the Bible with a weighted felt cloth and picked up the phone. The message from my mother was brief. Be there at 6. Do not wear that gray thing you wore last Christmas. Try to look like you can afford a haircut. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen. My hair was pulled back in a practical bun, a few strands escaping to frame a face that lacked the aggressive contouring and fillers my mother and sister favored. I looked like what I was tired, focused, and entirely uninterested in their masquerade. But I had to go, not for them, but for her. Grandma Eleanor was the only person in that cold, echoing mausoleum of a family who had ever looked at me and seen a human being rather than an asset or a liability. The drive to Vance Manor took 40 minutes, winding up the hills until the city fog was just a carpet beneath us. The estate was a sprawling neo-Gothic monstrosity that my grandfather had bought during the boom years, a place designed to intimidate rather than welcome. As I pulled my 10-year-old sedan up the long, crushed gravel driveway, I could already see the valet line. It was a parade of Italian sports cars and German luxury sedans, a showroom of wealth that made my rattling engine sound like a cough in a library. I handed my keys to a valet who looked at my car with open disdain. He did not bother to open the door for me. The air inside the manor was stifling, scented with expensive lilies and the metallic tang of ambition. 200 guests filled the grand hall, a space dominated by crystal chandeliers that cost more than my entire college education. The noise was a dull roar of networking. Everyone here was selling something, a new app, a hedge fund, a lifestyle, a lie. I tried to blend into the shadows near a marble pillar, clutching a glass of sparkling water like a shield. It did not take long for the comparisons to begin. Ilara. You actually came. The voice was high, sharp, and dripping with faux sweetness. I turned to see my sister, Sienna. She was radiant in a silver gown that looked like liquid mercury, designed to catch every flashbulb in the room. Sienna was the CEO of Lumina Nexus, a tech startup that promised to revolutionize data transfer through bioorganic interfaces. It was a string of buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing, and rumors were already swirling in the deeper corners of the financial district that the technology did not exist. But looking at her now, glowing with confidence, you would think she had just invented the wheel. Happy birthday to Grandma, I said quietly. You look nice, Sienna. She looked me up and down, her lip curling slightly. And you look comfortable. Mom is going to have a stroke when she sees those shoes. Are they orthopedic? Before I could answer, a waiter passed by with a tray of champagne. He stopped in front of me, not to offer a drink, but to thrust a pile of used napkins onto my empty hand. Here, take these to the back, he muttered. Distracted, scanning the room for someone more important, I stood there, frozen, holding the trash of strangers. Sienna threw her head back and laughed, a sound that drew the attention of the nearby investors. "Oh, that is rich," she giggled, placing a hand on the waiter's arm. "She is actually my sister. But do not worry, it is an honest mistake. She does have that help vibe, does she not?" I placed the napkins on a nearby table, my face burning. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back to my basement and the honest smell of old leather, but then I saw my parents. Richard and Beatrice Vance were holding court near the fireplace, flanking Grandma Eleanor like prison guards. My father, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, was gripping Grandma's wheelchair with white-knuckled intensity. He was talking loudly to a group of bankers, gesturing toward Grandma as if she were a prize exhibit. 90 years young, Richard bellowed. But you know how it is. The mind wanders. It is a tragedy. Really, we are just trying to make sure she is comfortable. The burden of managing the estate is just too much for her now. Beatrice nodded solemnly, adjusting the diamond choker at her throat. We are looking into full-time care facilities, somewhere quiet. She gets so confused. Poor dear. Just yesterday she thought I was the maid. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I pushed past Sienna and made my way toward them. As I got closer, I saw a man standing just outside the circle of sycophants. It was Harrison Sterling, the family lawyer. He was a man who usually projected granite-like stability, but tonight he looked pale. He was sweating, constantly checking his pocket watch, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. I slipped past my father, who was too busy boasting about his fund's quarterly projections to notice me. I knelt beside the wheelchair. "Grandma," I whispered. Eleanor Vance sat slumped in her chair, a tartan blanket over her knees despite the warmth of the room. Her eyes were milky and unfocused, staring at a point somewhere near the ceiling. Her mouth hung slightly open. To the casual observer, she was gone a shell waiting for the end. "Elara," my mother snapped, noticing me instantly. "Get up. You are wrinkling your dress. Not that it matters. Leave her alone. She does not know who you are." "I just wanted to say hello," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Well, say it and move," my father grumbled, checking his phone. "We have the presentation in 20 minutes. I leaned in close, pretending to fix the blanket around her legs. "Happy birthday, Grandma," I whispered into her ear. "I brought you some lavender from the garden you used to love." For a second, nothing happened. Then, the trembling hand resting on the armrest moved. It happened so fast that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. Her fingers, gnarled with arthritis, but surprisingly strong, gripped my wrist. The milky haze in her eyes seemed to vanish, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "Elara," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the cocktail jazz. "The vultures are circling." "I know," I whispered back, my heart hammering. "They are talking about a home. Grandma." "Let them talk," she hissed. "Listen to me. I do not have much time before they drag me on stage like a show pony." She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a book. It was small, roughly bound in peeling black leather, with corners that had been chewed away by time or mice. It looked like something you would find in a damp box at a garage sale and leave behind. "Take this," she commanded, shoving it into my hands. "Fix it, restore it, but do not let anyone see what is inside. Do not tell a soul." "What is it?" I asked, looking at the battered cover. "It is the truth," she said, her eyes burning. "And Elara, I am not giving you money. Money makes people stupid. I am giving you work, because you are the only one who knows the value of things that are broken." Before I could ask what she meant, a shadow fell over us. "What is that?" My mother's voice was like a whip crack. She snatched the book from my hands before I could hide it. She held it up by one cover, shaking it with disgust. A cloud of dust drifted down onto her polished shoes. "Ugh, Mother, where did you get this filth?" Beatrice shrieked. "Richard, look, she is hoarding trash again. I told you the dementia was getting worse. She is handing out garbage to the guests." Give it back," I said, standing up. "She gave it to me." My father laughed. A cruel, barking sound. "Gave it to you. Perfect. The scavenger gets the scraps. Honestly. Elara, have some dignity. We are trying to maintain an image here." He grabbed the book from my mother and walked over to a large, ornate waste bin near the catering station. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the book into the trash, right on top of a pile of discarded shrimp tails and wet napkins. "There," Richard said, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "Now, go wash your hands. Elara, you look like you have been digging in a dumpster." The humiliation was a physical heat that started in my chest and flooded my face. The guests nearby were watching, smirking behind their champagne flutes. Sienna was recording a video on her phone, probably for her story. "Family drama, LOL." The caption would read. I looked at my grandmother. She had reverted to her vacant stare, her head lolling to the side. But I saw her index finger tapping a slow, deliberate rhythm on her knee. Wait. I did not wait. I could not leave it there. Ignoring the whispers, ignoring my mother's hiss of "Elara, do not you dare." I walked over to the trash can. I reached in. I felt the cold slime of a cocktail napkin against my skin. But my fingers found the leather spine. I pulled the book out, clutching it to my chest, staining my dress with whatever residue was on the cover. "Pathetic," Sienna muttered as I walked past her, my head held high, clutching my garbage. I retreated to the far corner of the room, near the kitchen doors, trying to clean the book with the hem of my skirt. I felt small, defeated, and utterly alone. But I held on to the book. It was the only thing real in this entire room. A chime rang out, signaling silence. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the center of the room. My father stood there, microphone in hand, beaming with the charisma of a man who believes his own lies. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice booming, "thank you for joining us to celebrate the matriarch of the Vance legacy, my mother, Eleanor." Applause rippled through the room. A nurse wheeled Grandma into the spotlight. She looked tiny, swallowed by the darkness surrounding the beam of light. "But tonight is not just about looking back," Richard continued, his tone shifting to something more serious, more predatory. "It is about the future, about ensuring that the Vance legacy endures for another century. As many of you know, the market is shifting. We need agility. We need decisive leadership." He motioned to a screen that descended from the ceiling. A slide appeared: Vance Estate Restructuring Asset Consolidation. "My mother and I have been discussing this for months," Richard lied. "And tonight, in honor of her 90th birthday, she has decided to give the family the greatest gift of all. She is stepping down as the primary trustee of the Vance estate." A gasp went through the room, followed by excited murmurs. This was it, the hostile takeover disguised as a retirement party. "She has agreed to transfer full power of attorney and asset control to myself and Beatrice, effective immediately, to allow us to invest in the future specifically, a significant capital injection into Lumina Nexus." He gestured to Sienna, who waved regally. "Grandma?" "No," I whispered from my corner. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer, stepped forward. He looked like he was walking to the gallows. He placed a document on the table attached to Grandma's wheelchair. He placed a pen in her trembling hand. "Mother," Richard said, his voice dropping to a theatrical softness. "Sign here, for the family, for the future." The room was silent. 200 pairs of eyes watched the old woman. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out there and knock the pen away. They were stealing everything from her while the world cheered. Grandma Eleanor looked at the paper, then she looked up at Richard. Her hand shook violently. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar. She looked terrified, confused, and weak. She stammered into the microphone that Richard held to her lips. I am tired. Richard? I know, Mother, he said, practically drooling. Just sign, and you can rest. We will take care of everything. She lowered the pen. The tip touched the paper. Then she stopped. I will sign, she said, her voice quavering. But not tonight. My hand hurts. My eyes are blurry. Richard's smile faltered. Mother, the notary is here. It will just take a second. Tomorrow, Grandma Eleanor said, a little louder this time. I will sign your new will and your transfer papers tomorrow morning. Let me have my birthday, please. She looked up at him with wide, watery eyes. It was a masterstroke of guilt. If he forced her now, in front of everyone, he would look like a monster. He had to play the benevolent son. Richard grit his teeth, the vein in his temple throbbing. He forced a laugh. Of course, Mother. Tomorrow morning, first thing, tonight, we celebrate. He signaled the band, and the music started again, loud and jarring. I watched from the shadows as my parents and sister converged on her, whispering furiously, likely ensuring she would be isolated until morning. They thought they had won. They thought it was just a delay of 12 hours before they got their billions. But I felt the weight of the dirty book in my hands. I remembered the clarity in her eyes. The vultures are circling. They thought she was asking for a night of rest. I knew better. She was buying time, and she had just handed me the weapon. The drive home from the manor was a blur of fog and humiliation, but while I was retreating to my sanctuary of dust and paper, my family was engaging in a very different kind of nocturnal activity. I did not know the specifics at that exact moment. Of course, I was just the sister who played with trash. It was only later, through the cold lens of forensic accounting and court transcripts, that I learned exactly what kind of hell was breaking loose in the Vance penthouse while I slept, to understand the ferocity that was about to be unleashed upon me. You have to understand the mathematics of their desperation. My sister, Sienna, the golden child of Silicon Valley, was not just failing, she was drowning. Lumina Nexus, the company that had graced the cover of Forbes under the headline, "The Future is Organic," was technically insolvent. They had burned through $60 million of venture capital in 18 months on office parties, private jets, and a prototype that was essentially a glorified LED light strip. They owed $50 million to creditors who did not ask politely for repayment. My father was in no position to save her. Richard Vance, the Wizard of Wall Street, was currently sweating through his Egyptian cotton sheets because the Securities and Exchange Commission had quietly opened a file on his flagship fund 2 weeks prior. He had been shuffling money between accounts like a shell game to hide losses that exceeded 30% of his total assets under management. They had 72 hours. That was the deadline given by a private equity firm shadow bankers who specialized in distressed assets to post collateral for an emergency bridge loan. If they did not come up with $100 million in hard assets by Friday at noon, Sienna would be exposed as a fraud, and my father would be trading his bespoke suits for an orange jumpsuit. They needed Vance Manor. Specifically, they needed the land deeds and the unencumbered ownership of the estate to mortgage it to the hilt. But there was a problem, a quiet, bookish problem named Alara. They knew Grandma Eleanor had a soft spot for me. If she died or became incapacitated while I was still a primary beneficiary, I could contest the liquidation of the estate. I could tie them up in probate court for years. They did not have years. They did not even have a week. So, in the smoke-filled study of my father's penthouse, they made a decision that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with survival. I was a liability. I was a loose end. And loose ends had to be cut. The next morning, the sun filtered into my basement studio, illuminating the floating dust motes that I considered my only colleagues. The air smelled of old leather and wheat paste. a scent that usually calmed me, but today my hands were shaking. I had placed the book Grandma gave me on the central workbench. It was a hideous thing to the untrained eye. The leather was wrought red and peeling, and the spine was cracked, but as I ran my fingers over the binding, I felt the familiar hum of history. I set up my tools, a bone folder, a micro spatula, and a pot of reversible archival glue. I opened the cover. The end papers were marbled in a pattern that had not been popular since the late 19th century. I began to gently clean the surface dirt with a smoke sponge, working in small, circular motions. As I worked, I noticed an anomaly. The book appeared to be a standard ledger from the 1970s, listing household expenses, grocery bills, garden maintenance, staff wages. It was mundane, boring, even, but the thickness of the pages was wrong. I turned to page 42. It felt stiff, heavier than the others. I held it up to the light. It was opaque. I took my micro spatula and gently probed the edge of the paper. There was a seam. 2 pages had been glued together, expertly, with a paste that had yellowed over time. My heart began to race. Grandma had not given me a ledger. She had given me a puzzle. I applied a tiny amount of methyl cellulose to the edge to soften the old adhesive. It took me 2 hours of breathless, painstaking work to separate the sheets without tearing them. When the pages finally peeled apart, a cloud of stale, sweet scent released into the air. Hidden between the mundane lists of grocery expenses were handwritten notes in purple ink, Grandma's handwriting. But it was not the shaky scrawl of an old woman. It was the sharp, angular script of a CEO in her prime. Project Phoenix. The header read, Date October 14th, 1984. Below it were lists of assets I had never heard of. Warehouses in Oakland, a collection of rare manuscripts stored in a vault in Zurich, and a series of transfers to an entity called Veritas. The numbers were staggering. If these notes were real, the Vance family fortune was not just in the stock market or the manor. It was diversified, hidden, and completely off the books. Why had she hidden this? And why give it to me now? My contemplation was shattered by the ring of my cell phone. The screen flashed a number I did not recognize. Ms. Vance, a woman's voice, crisp and professional. This is the admissions office at Sunnyvale Meadows Memory Care. I dropped my bone folder. Sunnyvale Meadows was a polite name for a warehouse where rich people stored their elderly relatives until they expired. It was notorious for its high fees and heavy sedation policies. I think you have the wrong number, I said, my voice tight. My grandmother lives at Vance Manor. Not according to the paperwork we just received, the woman replied, sounding bored. Mr. Richard Vance has submitted an expedited admission form for Eleanor Vance. Transfer is scheduled for this afternoon, immediately following a legal consultation he has scheduled. We just need to confirm her dietary restrictions. The room spun. They were not waiting. They were going to force her to sign the new will, declare her incompetent, and ship her off to a facility where she would be drugged into silence all within the next 6 hours. Do not pick her up, I said, gripping the phone until my knuckles turned white. You do not have authorization. Mr. Vance has power of attorney, ma'am, or he will by noon. Goodbye. The line went dead. I stood there in the silence of my studio, a scream building in my throat that had nowhere to go. I looked at the book, this fragile, rotting thing that held secrets of a fortune, yet I could not use it to save her. I had no money for a lawyer. I had no influence. I was just the girl who fixed old paper. I grabbed my coat, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to move. I stepped out of my basement door onto the street, the San Francisco fog chilling the sweat on my forehead. Ms. Vance. I jumped back. A young man in a nondescript gray hoodie was standing by the newsstand next to my building. He looked terrified. He was clutching a paper bag from a coffee shop, but he was not drinking anything. I recognized him. He was the junior paralegal who carried Harrison Sterling's briefcase. I cannot talk, I said, stepping around him. Mr. Sterling sent me, he hissed, stepping in my path. He looked around nervously. checking the parked cars on the street. "He cannot be seen talking to you. Richard has eyes everywhere. What does Sterling want to tell me I am disinherited? I know already." "No," the young man whispered. He reached into his coffee bag and pulled out a small, black USB drive. He shoved it into my hand. The plastic was warm. "He said you need to hear this. He said he cannot stop them legally, not with the leverage they have on him, but he can give you the ammunition. Do not lose it. And for God's sake, do not tell anyone where you got it." Before I could ask a single question, he turned and sprinted down the street, disappearing into the crowd of tech workers heading to lunch. I stared at the drive in my hand. My heart was thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I went back inside, locking the deadbolt. I felt exposed. I felt hunted. I sat down at my computer, my hand hovering over the USB port, but before I could insert it, the heavy metal door of my studio rattled. Someone was pounding on it. Not a knock, a demand. "Open up, Elara. I know you are in there like a rat, Sienna." I shoved the USB drive into the pocket of my jeans and threw a cloth over the dismantled book. I went to the door and opened it. My sister stood there, looking out of place in the grimy alleyway in her $4,000 blazer and heels. She pushed past me without an invitation, her nose wrinkling at the smell of the chemicals. "God, it smells like a tomb in here," she sneered, scanning the room. "How do you live like this? It is embarrassing. Dad told me I should come check on you. Make sure you are not planning any tantrums." "Get out, Sienna," I said, standing by the door. She laughed, walking over to my workbench. She picked up a 17th century porcelain bowl I was repairing for a museum. It was worth more than her car. She tossed it casually in her hand. "We are worried about you, Elara. Really, we know you are upset about the will. But let us be honest. What would you do with a portfolio of stocks? You would probably buy a library or something tragic like that." "Put that down," I warned, my voice low. "Dad is doing what is best for the family," she continued, her eyes cold and hard. "Lumina Nexus is about to change the world. We need capital. Grandma is well. She has passed her expiration date. She is just a resource sitting there, rotting, like this place." She looked at me, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She opened her hand. The porcelain bowl fell. It hit the concrete floor with a sickening crunch, shattering into 100 irretrievable shards. I gasped, stepping forward. That bowl had survived wars. It had survived earthquakes. It had not survived my sister's ego. "Oops," Sienna said, stepping over the pieces. "Clumsy me. See, this is why you cannot be trusted with nice things. You are unstable." She walked up to me, invading my personal space, smelling of expensive perfume and decay. "Here is the deal. Elara, Dad is going to cut you a check for $5,000. You take it, you sign the waiver, and you disappear. If you try to fight us, if you try to see Grandma, we will bury you. We will sue you for harassment. We will have you evicted. We will make sure you never glue another book in this city again." She patted my cheek, a gesture so patronizing it made my skin crawl. "Do not be stupid. Be a good little failure and stay out of the way." She turned and left, the click-clack of her heels echoing like gunshots. I stood there for a long time, staring at the shattered porcelain. The anger that had been burning a slow fuse inside me suddenly detonated. They thought I was weak. They thought I was broken like the bowl. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the USB drive. I sat down at my desk and plugged it in. A single folder appeared on the screen titled Insurance. Inside were 3 audio files. I clicked on the first one. The sound of static filled the room, followed by the unmistakable voice of my father. "Sterling, stop whining. I do not care if she is lucid. I need that signature on the transfer deed by tomorrow. The loan sharks are giving me 72 hours before they break my legs, figuratively speaking. Of course, although with these guys, who knows?" Then, my mother's voice. "Just drug her tea. Richard, doctor, Thorne said he would sign the competency affidavit for 10 grand. If Alara tries to interfere, we will claim she is abusing the old bat. Who are they going to believe, the CEO of Lumina Nexus or the girl who lives in a basement? Sienna's voice chimed in, laughing. God, she is such a loser. It is almost charity to cut her out. We are saving her from the burden of wealth. I listened to the recording, my hands trembling. This was not just family drama. This was conspiracy. This was fraud. This was criminal intent. They were right about one thing. I was a failure in their world. I failed to be cruel. I failed to be greedy. I failed to see people as assets. But as I looked at the shattered bowl and the hidden notes from the book, I realized something. You do not fix a broken spine by forcing it. You fix it by understanding how it was put together, and then, slowly, methodically, you take it apart. My parents had signed a contract with the devil to save their skins, but they did not realize that the devil had already left the building, and he had left his playbook with me. I picked up the phone. I was not calling the nursing home. I was calling the number listed in the back of the book under Veritas. Hello? I whispered to the empty room. I am ready to play. The heavy iron gates of Vance Manor were locked, and the security cameras that swept the perimeter were looking for intruders, but I was not an intruder. I was a ghost of this house. A child who had spent 20 years exploring every crevice of the estate, while my parents were busy climbing social ladders. I knew that the third gargoyle on the east wing concealed a service latch, and that the library chimney had a crawl space that led directly to the master suite. It was 2 a.m. when I parked my car a mile down the road and hiked through the dense fog of the tree line. The USB drive burned a hole in my pocket. But I was not here to plant evidence. I was here for answers. I slipped through the servants' entrance near the wine cellar, using a key I had stolen and duplicated when I was 12. The house breathed around me, a slumbering beast of mahogany and velvet. I moved silently through the hallways, dodging the sweeping red eyes of the motion sensors by sticking to the blind spots I had memorized as a game in my youth. When I reached the door to the master suite, I hesitated. If my father found me here, he would not just call the police. He would claim I was trying to murder my grandmother to stop the will changes. It would be the perfect narrative to destroy me. I turned the handle. It was unlocked. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the medical monitors they had installed to make Grandma look frailer than she was. She was lying in the massive 4-poster bed, a tiny lump under the silk duvet. "Grandma," I whispered, creeping closer. "It is Alara." I expected to see the confused, medicated woman from the party. I expected to have to shake her awake. Instead, the bedside lamp clicked on. Eleanor Vance was sitting up, propped against 3 pillows. She was wearing her reading glasses and reviewing a stack of documents that looked suspiciously like stock reports. There was no drool, no vacancy in her eyes. She looked like the iron-willed matriarch who had terrified board members for 4 decades. "You took your time," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "I expected you an hour ago." I nearly collapsed with relief. "You are okay. You are you. Of course I am me," she scoffed, removing her glasses. "Did you really think I would let my brain turn to mush while those vultures circled my bed? I have been spitting out my pills into the flower pot for 3 months. My geraniums are very sedated, but I am perfectly fine." I rushed to the side of the bed, grabbing her hand. "Grandma, we have to get you out of here. I know everything. Richard and Sienna are in debt, deep debt. They are going to force you to sign the estate over tomorrow morning so they can mortgage the manor. I have recordings. We can go to the police." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly painful. "No police, not yet. But they are going to put you in a home, a terrible one, and they are stealing your legacy. They are stealing a corpse, Alara," she said, her eyes gleaming with a cold, terrifying intelligence. "I know about the debts. I know Sienna's company is a Ponzi scheme built on smoke and mirrors. I know your father has been cooking the books since 2015. Why do you think I stepped back? I wanted to see how far they would go. She reached under her mattress and pulled out a fountain pen. It was purple, her signature color. Listen to me closely, child. Tomorrow morning, that lawyer, Sterling, will come here with your parents. They will have a doctor, that slimy man. Dr. Thorne, who will certify that I am lucid enough to sign a will, and then immediately certify that I am too frail to manage my own affairs. It is a classic move. We can stop them, I insisted. We will do no such thing, she commanded. You will be there, and you will do exactly what they expect you to do. You will cry, you will beg, you will be the pathetic, emotional failure they believe you are. You must let them think they have won. Why? I asked, tears stinging my eyes. Why give them what they want? Because, she said, leaning in close, if I fight them now, they will drag this out in court. They will use their remaining influence to freeze everything. But if they think they have won, they will get sloppy. They will take ownership of the estate. And when you take ownership of the Vance estate, Elara, you take ownership of everything attached to it, she tapped the side of her nose, including the liabilities. My mind raced back to the book she had given me, the hidden pages, Project Phoenix. The book, I realized. The assets in the book, they are not part of the Vance estate. Are they? Smart girl. She smiled. I separated them 40 years ago. I built a firewall between the family money and my money. The Vance Group is a sinking ship. Elara, it is riddled with toxic debt and impending lawsuits. Tomorrow, your father is going to sign a piece of paper that makes him the captain of the Titanic 5 minutes after it hit the iceberg. But the will, I said, they are going to cut me out. Let them, she said. I have arranged a little addendum with Sterling. He is a coward, but he is a greedy coward, and I paid him more than your father did. Now go. You need to look exhausted and desperate in the morning. I slipped out of the room just as the sun began to bleach the sky gray. I did not sleep. I spent the hours pacing in my car, rehearsing my defeat. At 9 a.m, I walked through the front doors of Vance Manor. My mother was already there, directing the staff to pack up Grandma's porcelain collection. Elara, Beatrice said, not looking up from her clipboard. We did not invite you. I have a right to be here, I said, letting my voice crack. Please, Mother, do not do this. Save the drama for your diary, she snapped. We are in the library. Try not to make a scene. The library was an imposing room lined with first editions that my father had never opened. Grandma was in her wheelchair by the desk. Richard was pacing. Sienna was texting on the sofa. Dr. Thorne, a man who smelled of stale tobacco and nervous sweat, was wiping his glasses. Harrison Sterling stood by the desk, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Let us get this over with, Richard said as I entered. Oh, great. The audience is here. Grandma, I cried out, rushing over to her. I fell to my knees beside the wheelchair. I did not have to fake the tears. The stress was real enough. Please, do not sign. They are using you. Grandma looked at me with that vacant, glassy stare she had perfected. She patted my head weakly. Who is this? She asked, looking at Richard. It is nobody. Mother, Richard said, shoving me aside. Dr. Thorne, if you please. Doctor. Thorne stepped forward. He shone a light in Grandma's eyes for 2 seconds. Pupils are responsive. She seems oriented enough for the moment, but clearly, she is deteriorating. I would recommend immediate transfer of power after the signature. Excellent, Richard said. Sterling, read the amendment. Sterling cleared his throat. He held up a thick document. This is the 4th Amendment to the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance, Sterling read, his voice monotone. It revokes all previous bequests to Elara Vance. It transfers the entirety of the Vance Manor, the Vance Group holdings, and all associated physical assets to Richard and Sienna Vance. And the exclusion clause? Sienna asked, looking up from her phone. Yes, Sterling said. Clause 4B, Elara Vance is to be excluded from all inheritance of family property, stocks, and bonds, receiving a sum total of $0 from the primary estate. I grabbed my father's arm. Dad, please, you are destroying the family. Grandma built this. I am saving it, Richard yelled, shaking me off. You are just jealous because you are getting nothing. You are a failure. Ilara, you always have been. Now stand back and shut up. I shrank back against the bookshelf, sobbing into my hands. I peeked through my fingers. Richard and Beatrice were practically vibrating with excitement. They saw the finish line. Sterling placed the document in front of Grandma. Sign here, Mrs. Vance. Grandma picked up the pen. Her hand shook. She wrote a shaky E. Then she stopped. She mumbled. I want to add something. No additions, Beatrice shrieked. Just sign it. It is for the girl, Grandma whispered. She is sad. Let me leave her the little trust, the one from the old days. Richard rolled his eyes. What trust? She does not have any trusts, Sterling intervened, his face pale. She refers to the anonymous trust, sir. It is an old account, dormant for decades. I believe the balance is nominal. How nominal? Sienna asked sharply. Last I checked, the operating capital was negligible. Sterling said, It is mostly sentimental paperwork. Richard laughed. Fine, whatever. Give her the sentimental garbage. Just sign the damn paper. Sterling quickly pulled out a secondary page. I will add a handwritten codicil. The beneficiary Ilara Vance shall receive sole ownership of the anonymous trust and its contents. Grandma took the purple pen. She did not look at me. She signed the main document with a scrawl that looked like a seismograph of an earthquake. Then, she signed the codicil. Done, Richard breathed. He snatched the papers away before the ink was dry. It is done. We own it. And the guardianship? Beatrice asked Dr. Thorne. I am signing the incapacitation order now, Thorne said, scribbling on his clipboard. She is legally under your care, effective immediately. Richard turned to me, a triumphant grin stretching his face. Well, Ilara, you heard the lady. You get the sentimental trash. I think there is a box of old greeting cards in the attic. That is the anonymous trust. Probably. Now get out of my house. Sienna laughed. Make sure you check the trash cans on your way out. Ilara, you might find another book to glue together. I stood up. I wiped my face. I looked at Grandma one last time. She was slumped in her chair, eyes closed, looking like she had fallen asleep. But as I turned to leave, I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Goodbye, Father, I said softly. Congratulations on your win. Get out, he roared. I walked out of the library, past the servants who looked down at the floor. I walked out the front door and down the steps to my car. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. The trust is not empty. Go to the bank. Code Phoenix. I drove away from Vance Manor, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror. They were popping champagne in there right now. They were celebrating the acquisition of a billion-dollar estate. They did not know that they had just signed a contract to inherit a mountain of debt that was about to landslide, and they had just handed me the lifeboat. I drove straight to the First National Bank in downtown San Francisco. I asked for the private client manager, a man named Mr. Henderson. When I told him I was there for the anonymous trust and gave him the code, his eyebrows shot up into his hairline. Ms. Vance, he said, ushering me into a soundproof vault room. We have been waiting for this day for 20 years. Your grandmother was very specific. He placed a heavy metal box on the table. Inside was not money. It was a single sheet of paper and a digital key. The trust, Mr. Henderson explained, holds the legal title to Veritas Archives. It is a holding company. What does it hold? I asked. Everything, he said. The art collection, the intellectual property rights to the Vance historical patents, and the cash reserves she pulled out of the market before the crash of 2008. It is all in there. And as of 10 minutes ago, when the lawyer filed the digital update, it is 100% yours. I looked at the paper. The value at the bottom of the page was a number that made my head spin, but what caught my eye was the note clipped to it in purple ink. For the girl who loves broken things, now, break them. I smiled. The game had just changed. My parents had the crown, but I had the kingdom. And the executioner was on his way. The ink on my grandmother's signature was barely dry before the scavengers began to feast. If I had expected a period of mourning or at least a respectful silence for the supposed decline of the family matriarch, I was naive. The speed at which my father and sister moved was not just efficient, it was predatory. Within 48 hours of obtaining the power of attorney and the new will, Richard Vance had secured a bridge loan. He did not go to a reputable bank. The major institutions had already flagged the Vance Group as a radioactive credit risk. Instead, he went to a firm called Titan Global Holdings. On paper, they were an international investment consortium. In reality, as the documents in my grandmother's secret archive later revealed, they were high-end loan sharks operating out of a shell office in the Cayman Islands. They gave my father $100 million in liquid capital. The collateral was everything the deed to Vance Manor, the remaining family stock, and my father's personal guarantee. The interest rate was predatory, calculated to devour the estate within 2 years if the principal was not repaid. But Richard did not care about 2 years from now. He cared about today. The spending spree that followed was grotesque. It was a desperate, manic attempt to project success to a world that was already whispering about their insolvency. My father bought a custom McLaren, a vehicle that cost $300,000, just to drive it to the golf club. He put a down payment on a 100-foot yacht he named the Vindicator. It was the behavior of a gambler who had just bet the mortgage on a single spin of the roulette wheel. Sienna was even worse. She took to social media with a vengeance. Her feed became a constant stream of filtered opulence. She posted videos of herself popping champagne in the backseat of a limousine, captioned, "New Era, New Leadership." But the worst part was the narrative she spun about me. To explain my absence and the sudden restructuring, they needed a villain. I became the designated scapegoat. Sienna posted a long, tearful video explaining that the family had been forced to cut ties with me due to my instability and financial irresponsibility. She hinted that I had tried to manipulate our grandmother. The comments section was a firing squad. Thousands of strangers called me a parasite, a gold digger, a disgrace. I was the outcast of the valley, while Sienna was the tech genius rising from the ashes. I stopped looking at my phone after the first day. I had bigger problems. 3 days after the signing, I returned to my apartment in the Mission District after a long shift at the museum. My key would not turn in the lock. I jiggled it, thinking it was just the damp air sticking the tumblers. But then the door opened from the inside. A stranger in a maintenance uniform stood there. Behind him, I could see my belongings packed into cardboard boxes. "Can I help you?" he asked, blocking my entry. "I live here," I said, panic rising in my throat. "What are you doing with my things?" "New ownership," he grunted, handing me a piece of paper. "Building was sold yesterday. All month-to-month leases were terminated effective immediately. We are renovating." I looked at the eviction notice. The new owner was a holding company called Vance Real Estate Ventures. My father had bought my apartment building. He had spent millions of dollars on a rundown complex just to evict me. It was not a business decision. It was a lesson. He wanted me to know that he could reach me anywhere. He wanted me homeless, broken, and crawling back to him for scraps. I did not crawl. I took my boxes. I loaded my sedan until the suspension groaned, and I drove to the only place I had left the storage warehouse where I kept my restoration supplies. It was a windowless concrete box in an industrial park near the airport. It smelled of dust and exhaust fumes. I set up a cot in the corner. Between a stack of 18th century maps and a pile of leather scraps, I had no shower, a hot plate for a kitchen, and a bucket for a bathroom. It was the lowest point of my life. I sat on the edge of the cot, shivering in the damp air, listening to the roar of jets taking off overhead, and I felt a wave of despair so black I thought I would drown in it. But then I looked at the purple book. I remembered Grandma's face. Let them think they have won. I dried my eyes. I was not a victim. I was an archivist, and I had work to do. While my parents were drinking vintage wine, I began to process the contents of the anonymous trust. I met Harrison Sterling in a 24-hour diner at 3 a.m. The lawyer looked like a haunted man. He kept checking over his shoulder, terrified that Richard would see him consorting with the enemy. "This is insane," Sterling hissed, sliding a thick folder across the greasy table. "Do you know what your grandmother did? She moved the assets years ago. Years I thought these were just tax shelters." "Tell me about the art," I said, ignoring his panic. "The art," he whispered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The collection hanging in Vance Manor, the Rubens, the Turners, they are high-quality reproductions, museum-grade fakes commissioned in the 80s. I felt a chill run down my spine. My parents were currently mortgaging the manor based on the appraisal value of those paintings. They believed they were surrounded by $50 million of canvas and oil. "And the originals," I asked, "in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva." Sterling said, "Owned by a shell company called Veritas Archives, which is now owned by the Anonymous Trust, which is owned by you." I opened the folder. There were the authentication certificates, the provenance papers, the insurance evaluations. The collection was not worth $50 million. In the current market, with the art world hungry for old masters, it was worth nearly $200 million. My parents were sitting in a house full of posters, thinking they were kings, while the real treasury was sitting in my pocket. "We need to activate Veritas," I told Sterling. "I want full incorporation. I want bank accounts opened. I want to be ready to buy." "Buy what?" Sterling asked. "You have liquid assets. Elara, you could retire to Tuscany tomorrow." "I am not retiring," I said, sipping my lukewarm coffee. "I am going shopping. When the Vance Group defaults, I want to be the first creditor in line." While I plodded in the shadows, the sun was shining brightly on Siena. It was the week of the Lumina Nexus product launch. The tech world was buzzing. She held a press conference that rivaled an Apple event. She walked on stage in a black turtleneck, holding a small, sleek device that she claimed could interface directly with the human nervous system to upload data. "The future is not screen to eye," she proclaimed to thunderous applause. "It is chip to mind." The stock price of the Vance Group, which had heavily invested in Lumina, skyrocketed. On paper, my family was now worth billions. Richard gave interviews to major financial news networks, bragging about his visionary investment strategy. He looked tan, rested, and utterly arrogant, but I knew the truth. I had read the technical specs in Grandma's files. The device Sienna was holding was a hollow shell. The technology was stolen from a defunct German research lab that had abandoned the project 10 years ago because it caused seizures in test subjects. It was a fraud, a dangerous, illegal fraud. But for now, the illusion held. They were on top of the world. Then, the call came. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was carefully cleaning a patch of mold off a Renaissance prayer book when my phone rang. It was Richard. "Elara," he said. No greeting, no apology for the eviction. His voice was smooth, dripping with the condescension of a man who has won everything. "I hear you are living in a storage unit. How bohemian. What do you want?" "Richard?" I asked. "I am feeling generous," he said. "Sienna's launch was a triumph. We are swimming in capital. And your mother, bless her heart, feels bad about you sleeping with the rats. So, I have a proposition. I am listening. I have prepared a check for $5,000, he said. Enough to get you a deposit on a studio apartment. Somewhere far away, maybe Ohio. In exchange, I need you to sign a document." "What kind of document?" "A quitclaim deed," he explained. "And a standard non-disclosure agreement. Basically, you formally waive any future right to contest the will. You acknowledge that you have no claim on the Vance estate, and you admit for the public record that you are mentally unfit to manage complex financial assets. It is just to tidy up the paperwork. We cannot have you popping up in 10 years trying to sue us." $5,000. They had just raised $100 million. and he was offering me $5,000 to sell my dignity forever. "I will sign it," I said. There was a pause on the other end. He had expected a fight. He had prepared his threats, and I had robbed him of the pleasure of using them. "You will?" he stammered. "Yes," I said, injecting a tremor of defeat into my voice. "You win. Dad, I am tired. I just want a place to sleep. I do not want to fight you anymore. You are too strong." I could practically hear his ego inflating through the speaker. "Well, that is the first smart thing you have said in years. Come to the office in an hour and try to look presentable." I wore my oldest, most frayed sweater. I did not brush my hair. I walked into the gleaming glass tower of the Vance Group, looking exactly like the failure they needed me to be. Richard and Sienna were waiting in the boardroom, sipping sparkling water. The document was on the mahogany table. "Read it if you want," Sienna said, looking at her nails. "But do not pretend you understand the legal jargon." I did not read it. I knew exactly what it said. It was a trap for them, not for me. By signing this, I was confirming that I had no connection to the Vance estate. That meant when the debt collectors came, when the FBI arrived, when the lawsuits started flying, I would be legally untouchable. I was severing the limb before gangrene set in. I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. I signed Alara Vance with a flourish. Richard slid the check across the table. "There, 5,000. Don't spend it all on old books." "Thank you," I whispered, taking the check. "Now go," Richard said, waving his hand as if dismissing a servant. "We have real work to do. We are meeting with the bankers to discuss the expansion of Vance Manor. We are going to bulldoze the rose garden and put in a helipad." My heart stopped. The rose garden, that was Grandma's sanctuary. That was where she had buried her favorite dog. That was where she had taught me to read. "You are destroying the garden," I asked. "It is just dirt and thorns, Alara." Sienna laughed. "Progress requires pavement." I stood up. I clutched the check for $5,000. I looked at my father, then at my sister. They were glowing with the radioactive half-life of their own greed. They had no idea that the international investors they had borrowed from were already investigating the fake technology. They had no idea that the assets they were using as collateral were worthless copies. They had no idea that the girl standing in front of them owned the very ground they were planning to pave. "Enjoy the helipad," I said softly. "I hope the view is worth it." I walked out of the office. I took the elevator down to the lobby. I walked out into the busy street of San Francisco. I walked 2 blocks to the nearest bank. I deposited the $5,000 check. Then, I pulled out my phone and dialed Sterling. "It is done," I said. "They think I'm gone. They think they are safe." "Are you sure about this, Alara?" Sterling asked. "Once we execute the buy order on the debt, there is no going back. You will be the one foreclosing on your own parents." "They evicted me for spite, Sterling," I said, looking up at the glass tower where my family was celebrating their imaginary empire. "They are going to destroy her garden, execute the order, buy the debt, buy it all." I hung up. I was not just a restorationist anymore. I was the demolition crew, and the countdown had just reached 0. The month that followed my expulsion from the family was not defined by the passage of time, but by the accumulation of pressure. It felt less like 30 days and more like the slow, grinding turn of a vice. The air in San Francisco seemed to grow heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up whenever I drove past the gleaming skyline where my family was busy selling a future they did not own. Grandma Eleanor's decline was not the dramatic, chaotic event my parents had advertised to the press. It was quiet. It was the soft closing of a book that had been read thoroughly and loved deeply. The irony was that her health did deteriorate, but not because of the dementia my father had fabricated. It was simply time, her heart, which had beaten through the Great Depression, a world war, and the rise and fall of industrial empires, was simply tired. I knew she was dying, not because my parents told me they were too busy finalizing the color scheme for the funeral programs, but because the network of invisible loyalty she had built over 9 decades was still intact. A nurse at the facility, a woman whose tuition Grandma had secretly paid 10 years ago, called me on a burner phone every evening. She held the phone to Grandma's ear, and I would read to her. I read her the history of the Vance family, the real history, not the sanitized version on the company website. I read until her breathing slowed and the silence on the other end became final. She passed away on a Tuesday, while my father was at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a building he had not yet paid for, and my sister was live-streaming a makeup tutorial. When the news broke, the performance began. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was not a memorial. It was a press junket. My parents rented the largest cathedral in the city, a place where senators and movie stars were eulogized. They filled the pews with 2,000 people, most of whom had never met Eleanor Vance. There were floral arrangements that cost more than my college tuition, arranged to spell out legacy and vision. I arrived early, dressed in a simple black coat. I tried to enter through the main doors, but a security guard with a headset stopped me. He checked a list, his finger tracing down the names with agonizing slowness. "Ms. Vance," he said, not making eye contact. "You are not on the VIP list. Family seating is in the front loge." "I am her granddaughter," I said, my voice steady. "I have instructions from Mr. Richard Vance," he interrupted, his tone bored. "General seating only, or you can stand in the rear gallery with the staff. Your choice." I did not argue. I walked past the velvet ropes, past the rows reserved for the board of directors, the investors, and the tech moguls. I walked all the way to the back of the cathedral, to the shadows beneath the organ pipes. There, standing in a tight, silent cluster, were the people who actually knew her. Mr. Abernathy, the head gardener who had worked the soil of Vance Manor for 40 years, Mrs. Higgins, the cook who knew exactly how Grandma liked her tea, the maids, the drivers, the people my father called overhead. They made space for me. Mr. Abernathy took my hand. His palm was rough and calloused, a stark contrast to the manicured hands shaking in the front row. He did not say a word, but he squeezed my fingers, and that anchor was the only thing that kept me from screaming. From my vantage point, the service looked like a play. Richard stood at the pulpit, dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. He spoke about burden and sacrifice, and the torch being passed to a new generation. He never mentioned her kindness. He never mentioned her grit. He talked about her assets as if they were her soul. "She built the foundation," Richard boomed, his voice amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. "And now, we will build the skyscraper." Sienna spoke next. She wore a black dress that was tastefully somber, but cut low enough to be provocative. She talked about how Grandma had inspired her startup, a lie so bold I felt the air leave the room. She managed to mention the stock ticker symbol for the Vance Group 3 times during her eulogy. When the service ended, the mourning period was officially over. The reception was not a wake with sandwiches and coffee. It was a catered gala at the Fairmont Hotel, and the main event was not the sharing of memories. It was the reading of the will. This was unusual. Typically, wills are read in private law offices, behind closed doors. But Richard insisted on this. He wanted a spectacle. He had invited the financial press, the cameras, and most importantly, the creditors. The representatives from Titan Global Holdings were there. Men in suits that cost more than my car. Standing near the bar with eyes like sharks, Richard needed them to see the transfer of power. He needed to prove to them that the collateral for his $100 million loan was officially his, and he needed to humiliate me. He wanted a public execution of my status to ensure I could never challenge him. The ballroom was buzzing with the low roar of gossip. Waiters circulated with trays of caviar. I stood by a pillar near the emergency exit, clutching the battered book Grandma had given me. It was my talisman. At 2 p.m, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Harrison Sterling walked onto the stage. The lawyer looked thinner than the last time I had seen him. His skin was gray, and he was sweating despite the air conditioning. He carried a leather portfolio. In his hand was a thick envelope sealed with red wax. Richard and Beatrice sat in the front row, center stage, on high-backed chairs that looked like thrones. Sienna sat next to them, her phone raised on a tripod, broadcasting to her 2 million followers. "Hey guys," she whispered into her microphone, her voice amplified slightly by the acoustics of the room. "We are about to start. It is a sad day, but also a day of closure. Sending love to everyone supporting Lumina Nexus right now." Sterling placed the envelope on the podium. His hands were trembling. He adjusted the microphone. The feedback squeal made everyone wince. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice cracking, "we are gathered here to execute the final wishes of Eleanor Vance." He looked out at the crowd. He looked at the Titan Global reps, who were checking their watches. He looked at Richard, who gave him a sharp, impatient nod. Finally, he looked at the back of the room, into the shadows where I stood. Our eyes locked for a fraction of a second. "Per the instructions of the deceased," Sterling continued, "this reading is public and binding." He broke the wax seal. The sound of the cracking wax echoed in the silent room like a bone snapping. He pulled out the document. It was thick, heavy cream paper. Richard leaned over to Beatrice. He did not bother to lower his voice much. I could read his lips, and the nearby microphones picked up the hiss of his whisper. "Get ready," Richard smirked. "Watch the brat cry. This is going to be the best part." Beatrice stifled a giggle, patting his knee. "Be nice, Richard. She's going to be devastated." I tightened my grip on the book. I felt the rough leather against my palm. I was not going to cry. I was the storm that they had failed to forecast. Sterling cleared his throat. He did not read the standard legal preamble. He skipped the pleasantries. He went straight to the clause that Richard had dictated in the library that morning a month ago. "I, Eleanor Vance, being of sound mind and body," Sterling read, "do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments." He paused. The silence was absolute. You could hear the hum of the ventilation system. "To my son, Richard, and my granddaughter, Sienna." Sterling read. Richard sat up straighter. Sienna preened at the camera. "You have requested full control of the Vance estate. You have demanded that I cut the failure of the family, my granddaughter Ilara, out of the line of succession for the primary assets." A ripple of uneasy laughter went through the crowd. It was cruel phrasing, and hearing it read aloud made some of the guests shift in their seats. But Richard just smiled, nodding in agreement. "I grant this request," Sterling read. Richard pumped his fist subtly. Sienna flashed a thumbs up to her live stream. "Therefore," Sterling continued, turning the page, "the Fourth Amendment to this will is now active." He looked up. He was no longer trembling. A strange calm had settled over him, the calm of a man who has already jumped off the cliff and is simply waiting to hit the water. "According to the latest amendment request, signed and witnessed on the 28th of January, Sterling announced, his voice ringing out with sudden clarity, "this document has immediate effect and supersedes every other agreement, contract, or lien previously established." Richard frowned. He looked at Beatrice. "Supersedes. What does that mean for the loan?" "Shh," Beatrice hissed. "He is getting to the money." Sterling took a breath. He looked directly at Richard. "The distribution of the assets," Sterling said, "is as follows." Harrison Sterling stood at the podium, a solitary figure against the backdrop of velvet curtains and overpriced floral arrangements. He adjusted his glasses, the lenses reflecting the harsh glare of the camera lights that Sienna had set up. The room was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit and the frantic, rhythmic tapping of my sister's acrylic nails on her phone screen. He looked down at the parchment in his hands. It was not a standard legal document. It was a letter, written in the sharp, undeniable hand of Eleanor Vance, transcribing her final judgment upon the people sitting in the velvet chairs. I will read the preamble as dictated by the deceased, Sterling announced, his voice projecting to the back of the room where I stood in the shadows. To my son, Richard, and my granddaughter, Sienna, Sterling read. He paused, letting the names hang in the air. You came to me in my final weeks. You stood by my bedside not to offer comfort, but to demand control. You insisted that I remove Alara Vance, the child you labeled a failure and a stain on our legacy, from the list of beneficiaries. You argued that she possessed neither the business acumen nor the social standing to manage the Vance assets. Richard nodded solemnly. A performance of grave responsibility. He leaned toward the Titan Global executive seated in the second row and whispered something that looked like, "It was a hard decision, but necessary," Sterling continued. You asked for sole dominion over the family name. You asked for the removal of the failure. I have considered your request, and I grant it. The tension in the front row snapped like a rubber band. Richard clapped his hands together once. A sharp sound of victory. Sienna let out a breathy laugh, turning her face to her camera to give a sad but brave smile to her live stream audience. "Thank you," Richard said, loud enough for the press to hear. "It is what Mother would have wanted, keeping the legacy strong." The investors from Titan Global relaxed. Leaning back in their chairs, they had heard what they needed to hear. The asset was secure. Their loan was backed by the entire estate. "Please hold your applause," Sterling said, his voice cutting through the self-congratulatory murmur. He did not look up from the page. "I will now detail the distribution of the estate as outlined in the Fourth Amendment. Item 1, Sterling read, to Richard Vance and Sienna Vance. I leave the entirety of the real estate known as Vance Manor, located at 101 Skyline Boulevard. I leave the full controlling interest in the Vance Group. I leave the title to the family yacht, the Vindicator, and I leave all existing bank accounts held under the name of the Vance Family Trust." This time, the applause was genuine. A few of Richard's sycophants in the back cheered. Sienna raised her hands in a victory V, framing her face for the screenshot. "We did it," I saw Beatrice mouth to Richard. "We own it all." I stood perfectly still. I felt the leather of the book in my hand. It was warm. I knew what was coming. "However," Sterling said, the word was not loud, but it had the weight of a gavel strike. He raised a hand, palm out, silencing the room. "Attached to these specific assets," Sterling continued, his pace accelerating slightly, "are the following conditions, which are non-negotiable and binding upon acceptance of the inheritance." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Standard probate taxes. We know the drill. Sterling, move on." "It is not just taxes, Mr. Vance," Sterling said, looking directly at my father. "By accepting the Vance Manor and the Vance Group shares, the beneficiaries Richard and Sienna Vance immediately assume full personal liability for all outstanding liens, mortgages, and debts attached to these properties." "Obviously," Richard scoffed, checking his watch. "We will clear the books with the liquid capital. Just give us the account numbers." Sterling turned the page. The sound of the paper rustling was deafening. "The current liabilities include," Sterling read, 3 separate mortgages on Vance Manor totaling $45 million, taken out by Richard Vance via power of attorney in the last month." The room went quiet. The Titan Global reps sat up. They knew about the bridge loan they had given, but they did not know about the existing mortgages. "Furthermore," Sterling continued, "the Vance Group is currently carrying $60 million in unsecured debt, and there is a pending IRS audit regarding the misclassification of funds in the amount of $12 million. As the new owners, Richard and Sienna Vance are now personally responsible for the immediate repayment of these obligations." Richard's face lost its color. "Wait, that is corporate debt. That does not transfer to us personally. It does when you sign a restructuring agreement to secure a bridge loan, as you did 3 days ago," Sterling said. "But let us discuss the assets you will use to pay this." "Yes, the cash," Sienna snapped, her voice shrill. "Grandma had accounts in Switzerland. She had the art. Just read the part about the money. Sterling looked at Sienna. There was no pity in his eyes. Item 2, liquid assets, Sterling read. To Richard and Sienna Vance, I leave the total balance of the primary Vance family accounts. He paused. He looked at the paper. He looked at the audience. The total sum is $1. For a second, nobody moved. It was as if the words had not translated into English. Excuse me. Beatrice stood up, her pearls rattling. Did you say 1 million? I said $1, Sterling repeated, enunciating every syllable. $1 single dollar. That is impossible, Richard roared, jumping to his feet. He knocked his chair over. She was worth hundreds of millions. The art collection alone is worth 50 million. The offshore accounts. Where is it? The art collection hanging in Vance Manor, Sterling said, his voice deadly calm, is composed of high-quality reproductions. They have no commercial value. Liar, Sienna screamed, dropping her phone. The live stream was now filming the ceiling, capturing the audio of their meltdown. I saw the appraisals. I saw the insurance papers. You saw the insurance papers for the originals, Sterling corrected her. But the originals are not part of the Vance family estate. What are you talking about? Richard demanded, marching toward the podium. The Titan Global men were standing up now, blocking the exit. The air in the room had turned from celebratory to violent. If they are not in the estate, where are they? Sterling flipped to the final page of the document. 6 months ago, Sterling said, speaking into the microphone so the whole room could hear. Eleanor Vance executed a private sale. She liquidated her entire personal portfolio. She sold the original art collection. She sold the rights to the historic patents. She emptied the Swiss accounts. She consolidated every cent of actual value into a holding company. She could not do that, Richard yelled. She was senile. She was declared competent by your own doctor. Sterling reminded him. Doctor, Thorne certified her lucidity the day she signed the sale contract. I have the video evidence. Richard froze. He realized the trap he had set for Grandma had just snapped shut on his own leg. Who did she sell it to? Beatrice whispered, her face as white as the lilies on the stage. Who has the money? She sold the entire portfolio, Sterling said, for the sum of $1. It was a symbolic transfer to a company called Veritas Archives. Veritas, Sienna shrieked. I have never heard of them. Who owns Veritas? Sterling closed the folder. He took off his glasses. He looked past the screaming family, past the panicked investors, past the flashing cameras. He looked directly at me. The sole owner and beneficiary of Veritas Archives, Sterling declared, is the individual holding the promissory note, the individual you insisted on cutting out of the Vance estate, Ms. Elara Vance. Every head in the room turned. 200 people looked into the shadows at the back of the hall. I stepped forward. I did not look like a conqueror. I was wearing a thrift store coat and scuffed boots. But as I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I could feel their eyes shocked, calculating, terrified. I walked up to the stage. Richard was trembling. He looked like a man who was having a stroke. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Sienna was staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her hands clenched into fists. You, Richard finally choked out. You stole it. You manipulated her. I did nothing, I said, my voice calm, amplified by the silence of the room. I was fixing books in the basement. You were the one who demanded the restructuring. You were the one who hired the doctor. You were the one who told the world I was a failure, who deserved nothing from the Vance estate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled check for $5,000 that Richard had given me to sign the quitclaim deed. And you were the one who paid me $5,000 to sign a legal document stating I had no claim to your assets, I said, holding the check up, which means I also have no claim to your debts. I turned to the men from Titan Global. They were big men, with cold eyes and expensive suits. They were looking at Richard, and they looked very, very angry. Gentlemen, I said to the loan sharks, I believe Mr. Vance has used collateral he does not own to secure your loan. The house you have a lien on is mortgaged to 3 other banks. The art is fake, and the company's stocks are worthless. One of the Titan men stepped forward. He put a heavy hand on Richard's shoulder. Mr. Vance, the man said, his voice like gravel. We need to have a conversation. Outside. No, wait, Richard stammered, sweating profusely. Elara, baby, listen, we can fix this. We are family. You cannot let them take the house. Give us the money. Just transfer the Veritas funds back to the main account. We can pay everyone off. We can be a team. Beatrice rushed forward, grabbing my arm. Her grip was desperate. Elara, sweetheart, you know we love you. We were just testing you. Grandma wanted to see if you were strong enough. And you are. You pass now. Give Mommy the access codes. Sienna retrieved her phone and pointed it at me. Elara, the whole world is watching. Do not be a monster. Tell them you are going to save the family. I looked at them. I looked at the fear in their eyes. For years, I had craved their approval. I had wanted them to look at me and see something other than a disappointment. Now, they were looking at me as their savior. But I also saw the truth. They did not love me. They loved the lifeboat. I walked over to the podium. I placed the old, leather-bound book on the surface. I opened it to the page where Grandma had written her final note in purple ink. Failure is just what the world calls things that have not yet had their time to shine. I looked at Richard. You wanted me to be a failure, Dad. You spent my whole life ensuring I knew my place. Well, I am accepting my role. I am the failure. And failures do not have millions of dollars to bail out bad investments. Elara, please, Richard screamed as the Titan men began to steer him toward the exit. They will kill me. They will take everything. They cannot take everything, I said softly. I reached into the leather folder Sterling had left on the podium. I pulled out a single, crisp $1 bill. I walked over to Richard. I tucked the bill into the breast pocket of his $3,000 suit. You still have this, I said. Grandma left it specifically for you. Don't spend it all in one place. You witch, Sienna screamed, lunging at me. Security guards intercepted her before she could reach me. They were not Richard's guards anymore. They were hired by the venue, and they knew who was paying the bill for the reception. It wasn't Richard. Ms. Vance, the head of security said to me, ignoring my screaming sister. Do you want us to clear the room? No, I said, watching my parents being dragged out of the spotlight they had coveted for so long. Let them stay. I want them to see what happens next. Sterling stepped back up to the microphone. The reading of the will is concluded, he announced. The Vance estate is insolvent. All creditors may file their claims with Mr. Richard Vance directly. However, Veritas Archives is now open for business, and we are looking to acquire some historic property. I turned to the Titan Global representative, who was still holding my father. I believe you hold the note on the bridge loan, I asked. We do, the man scowled. 100 million, plus interest. The collateral is worthless, I said, but I'm willing to buy the debt from you for 10 cents on the dollar. Elara, no, Richard shrieked. You cannot buy my debt. That makes you your landlord, I finished. And your boss, and your creditor. I looked at the cameras, at the stunned faces of the socialites, and finally at the portrait of Eleanor Vance that hung above the stage. The vultures are done eating, I said. Now, the phoenix rises. The room did not explode immediately. It imploded. For a heartbeat, the air in the ballroom was sucked into a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. My father, Richard Vance, stood center stage, his hand clutching the single dollar bill I had placed in his pocket as if it were a burning coal. He looked at the paper, then at me, and then at the terrifyingly large men from Titan Global who were flanking him. The realization hit him not like a wave, but like a physical blow to the gut. He had just fought a war to conquer a kingdom, only to find out that the castle was built on quicksand and the gates were already burning. He was holding the deed to a hollow shell. Harrison Sterling, who had regained his composure now that the burden of the secret was off his shoulders, leaned into the microphone. He was not done. The first domino had tipped, but Sterling was about to kick over the entire table. "There is one final administrative matter regarding the transfer of real estate," Sterling announced, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. Richard looked up, sweat beading on his forehead. What else is there? We own the house. We can sell the house." "Actually, you cannot," Sterling said, flipping to a page marked with a red tab. "Upon the transfer of the title to Richard Vance, the accelerated repayment clauses have been triggered for the 3 separate mortgages currently held against Vance Manor." "3?" Beatrice shrieked from her seat. "We only have 1 mortgage." "That was true 6 months ago," Sterling corrected her, looking over the rim of his glasses at Richard. "However, according to bank records, Mr. Richard Vance, using his power of attorney, took out 2 additional high-interest loans against the property equity in November and December. He signed Eleanor Vance's name. I believe the forensic term is forgery, though in this specific context, since he is now the owner, it is simply debt." Sterling looked at the bankers seated in the 3rd row. They were already on their feet, phones to their ears. "Since the original owner, Eleanor Vance, is deceased, and the property has transferred to a party with a credit rating currently under investigation," Sterling continued, "the banks have exercised their right to demand immediate full repayment. The total amount due, including penalties for the undisclosed secondary liens, is $45 million, payable immediately." The sound that came out of my father was not human. It was the strangled yelp of a trapped animal. "I do not have $45 million, Richard screamed, turning to the Titan Global reps. "You have to help me. The equity used the loan money." "The loan money is frozen," the lead Titan agent said, his voice like grinding stones. He grabbed Richard's arm, his grip tightening. "You secured our $100 million with the equity of this house. If the house is mortgaged to 3 other banks, you committed fraud on our application. We are not investors anymore. Mr. Vance, we are victims, and we do not like being victims." Chaos erupted. It was a beautiful, terrifying anarchy. The room, filled with the elite of San Francisco, dissolved into a frenzy. The creditors who had been promised payouts from the estate realized there was nothing to claim. They began shouting, surging toward the stage. Waiters dropped trays of champagne. The flashing of cameras became a strobe light of disaster, capturing every second of the Vance family's disintegration. Sienna, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly snapped. The reality of her situation pierced through her narcissism. Her inheritance was gone. Her company funding was gone. Her social standing was vaporizing in real time. She looked at me, standing calmly in the aisle, and her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You?" she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You planned this. You thief! You stole our money!" She threw her phone down, though she forgot to stop the live stream, and lunged toward the podium. She shoved Sterling aside, grabbing the microphone. Her voice boomed through the speakers, shrill and hysterical. "Listen to me," she yelled to the room, though nobody was listening to her anymore. "My sister is a fraud. She manipulated a senile old woman. She stole the art. She stole the cash. That money belongs to Lumina Nexus. It belongs to the future." I did not retreat. I did not hide in the shadows. I walked up the stairs to the stage. I moved with a calmness that frightened me. It was the calmness of someone who has nothing left to lose, because they have already been burned to ash and rebuilt. Sienna saw me coming. She drew back her hand to slap me, a gesture she had used 1,000 times in our childhood. "Do not," I said. I did not shout. I did not raise my hand. I simply looked at her, and for the first time in her life, Sienna Vance saw something in my eyes that made her stop. She saw the grandmother she had ignored. She saw the iron will of Eleanor Vance staring back at her. Her hand dropped. I stepped past her. I took the microphone from the stand. I turned to face the chaotic room. "Quiet," I said. It was not a request. It was a command. Maybe it was the microphone. Or maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the moment. But the room fell silent. The bankers stopped shouting. The Titan agents paused. Even Richard stopped hyperventilating. I placed the battered book on the podium. I opened it. I did not look at the cameras. I looked at my father. "You called me a failure because I work with the past," I said, my voice steady. "You said I waste my time preserving old paper. But you forgot one thing. Father, the past keeps receipts." I lifted a sheaf of yellowed documents from the hollowed-out center of the book. "You are accusing me of theft," I said. "But let us look at the record. This book contains the original ledgers from the Vance Family Charity Foundation. 10 years ago, you were the treasurer." Richard's face went from pale to a sickly gray. "Elara, stop. Do not do this." 10 years ago, I continued, holding up a canceled check. $3 million vanished from the orphan fund. You told the board it was a clerical error. You told Grandma it was a bad investment. I turned the document around so the cameras could zoom in. But Grandma knew. She tracked the wire transfer. It went to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a company that, 2 days later, purchased a villa in Tuscany, the same villa you took your mistress to the following summer. A gasp went through the room. Beatrice let out a sound like a punctured tire. She turned to Richard, her eyes wide. "You said that was a corporate retreat. You said you bought it with your bonus." "I am not done," I said, flipping another page. 5 years ago, the pension fund for the estate staff, you drained it to cover the margin calls on your bad tech stocks. Mr. Abernathy, the gardener standing in the back, he thinks he has a retirement fund. He has nothing. You spent it on a sensory deprivation tank and a membership to a private jet club." I looked at Mr. Abernathy in the back of the room. He looked devastated. That hurt me more than anything else, but the truth had to come out. "And finally," I said, pulling out a printout of an email chain. "Lumina Nexus," Sienna gasped. "Shut up. That is proprietary." "It is fraud," I said. "Grandma had private investigators looking into your tech for a year. This is the report. The biochip does not exist. The prototype you showed the press last week. It is a stripped-down MP3 player inside a fancy plastic case. You have been taking pre-orders for a device that plays music, telling investors it uploads consciousness." I dropped the papers on the floor. They scattered like confetti at the world's worst party. "I did not steal the family legacy," I told them. "I bought it back before you could pawn it for spare parts. I did not inherit the assets because I do not want your blood money. I bought the soul of this family, and I accept zero responsibility for the debts created by your greed." I stepped back from the microphone. Behind me, on the large projection screen where Sienna had been casting her live stream, the chat was scrolling so fast it was a blur. OMG. Did she just say MP3 player? "Lumina Nexus is a scam. Sell. That sister is a savage. Vance stock is free-falling. Look at the ticker," someone in the crowd shouted. "Check the market." Phones lit up everywhere. The graph of the Vance Group stock, which had been artificially inflated all week, was now a vertical red line plunging towards zero. In seconds, millions of dollars of paper wealth evaporated. Sienna stared at the screen, watching her net worth vanish. She fell to her knees, sobbing not for her grandmother, but for her algorithm. Then, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. It was not more caterers. It was a phalanx of men and women in windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back. FBI, SEC, Harrison Sterling had been busy. He had not just tipped me off. He had saved his own skin by turning state's witness weeks ago. He had handed over the real books to the authorities, timing the raid for the moment the fraudulent transfer of the estate was signed. "Richard Vance, Sienna Vance," an agent shouted, stepping over the velvet rope. "Please place your hands where we can see them." The flashbulbs went crazy. This was the money shot. The Titan Global thugs released Richard. Stepping back to let the federal agents take over, they knew they would get their pound of flesh later. For now. The law had dibs. Richard looked around wildly, seeking an escape, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in the center of the stage he had built. And then, the final twist of the knife occurred. My mother, Beatrice, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly moved. She did not run to her husband. She did not run to her daughter. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and walked quickly toward me. Her face transformed. The shock vanished, replaced by a desperate, cloying sweetness that I recognized from every gala she had ever hosted. She opened her arms wide. "Elara," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh, my brilliant, brave girl, thank God you saved us. I knew you were the smart one. I told Richard. I said, Elara is the only one who knows what she is doing." She rushed at me, ignoring her husband who was being handcuffed. "Dearest daughter," she pleaded, reaching for my hands, "you will not let them take me, will you?" I did not know I was a victim too. Richard forced me. "But we have each other now, right? You and me, the Vance women, we can run Veritas together." She was close enough that I could smell her perfume, Chanel and Fear. She wanted to board the lifeboat. She wanted me to pay her bills, cover her shame, and keep her in the lifestyle to which she was addicted. I looked at her. I remembered being 10 years old, sick with a fever, and her leaving me with a nanny because she had a gala to attend. I remembered her laughing when Richard threw my books in the trash. I remembered her silence when they evicted me. I did not yell. I simply took one step back. It was a small movement, but it was a chasm. Her hands grasped at empty air. "Mother," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the hell breaking loose around us. "You are not a victim. You are an accomplice." I turned my back on her. "Elara!" she screamed, her mask falling away, revealing the ugly, terrified woman beneath. "You ungrateful brat, I gave birth to you." "And I survived you," I said without looking back. I walked off the stage, past the FBI agents who were reading Sienna her rights, past the weeping investors, past the ruins of the Vance dynasty. I walked toward the exit, clutching the only thing that mattered, the book of truth. The dominoes had all fallen, and I was the only one left standing. The crisp green bill sat on the dashboard of my car as I drove up the winding road to the estate. $1 single. To most people, it was a negligible amount of currency, not enough for a cup of coffee. Barely enough for a pack of gum. But in the forensic accounting of the Vance family destruction, that $1 single was the heaviest object in the world. It was, legally speaking, the only clean asset my father and sister possessed. Everything else, the bank accounts, the stock portfolios, the luxury vehicles, the offshore holdings, had been instantly frozen by a federal injunction the moment the FBI stepped onto that stage. The forensic accountants were currently tearing through the Vance Group's servers like termites, and what they were finding was a web of toxicity that contaminated every single cent Richard Vance had touched for the last decade. But that $1 that came from the private, personal wallet of Eleanor Vance, it was part of the legitimate sale of Veritas archives. It was the only unencumbered, debt-free capital Richard and Sienna had to their names. I found a grim mathematical satisfaction in that. It was the precise value of their integrity. While I navigated the curves of Skyline Boulevard, my father and sister were experiencing a very different kind of transport. They had been separated at the precinct. Richard was in interrogation room B, sweating through his Italian silk suit as agents walked him through the timeline of his wire fraud. They were asking him about the 3 separate banks he had defrauded to mortgage the manor. They were asking about the inflated valuation reports he had emailed to Titan Global. Sienna was in a holding cell, likely discovering that her influence did not extend to the booking officer. She was facing charges of securities fraud for Lumina Nexus. Selling a non-existent technology to investors is a felony, and doing it while live streaming the success is a prosecutor's dream. I pulled up to the iron gates of Vance Manor. Yesterday, these gates had been barred to me. Yesterday, I was the trespasser. Today, The electronic reader scanned the transponder on my windshield, a new code issued by Veritas Archives, and the heavy metal wings swung open silently. I drove up the gravel path. The valet stand from the funeral reception was gone, knocked over in the chaos of the exodus. A few abandoned champagne flutes lay in the grass, sparkling in the afternoon sun like diamonds, but they were just cheap glass. I parked the car and walked to the front door. The house was silent. The staff had fled when the police arrived, terrified of being implicated. I used the master key, the real key, the heavy brass one Grandma had given me years ago. Not the digital keycard my parents had installed. I stepped inside. The air was still thick with the scent of the lilies from the funeral, now beginning to rot. It was a cloying, sweet smell that masked the underlying odor of decay. I walked through the grand hall, my footsteps echoing on the marble. I expected to feel triumphant. I expected to feel a surge of vindictive joy at reclaiming the space where I had been tormented, but I felt only a profound, quiet relief. I walked into the library. The spot where Richard had forced Grandma to sign the papers was empty. I ran my hand over the desk. This was not a conquest. I had not taken this house to live in it as a queen. I had taken it to stop them from turning it into a commodity. I felt Grandma's presence in the dust motes dancing in the light. She was not haunting the place. She was holding it up. This was not revenge. Revenge is hot and chaotic. This was protection. It was the cold, hard shield of stewardship. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the bank. The mortgage acquisition was complete. Veritas Archives had purchased the toxic debt from the 3 banks and Titan Global for pennies on the dollar. Since the default was immediate, the title had reverted to the note holder. I owned the house. I owned the debt. I owned the silence. But while I stood in the quiet sanctuary of the library, my mother was experiencing the loudest hour of her life. Beatrice Vance had not been arrested. She was not a signatory on the fraudulent loans, and her name was not on the Lumina Nexus Incorporation papers. She was, in the eyes of the law, merely the wife of a criminal, but in the eyes of society, she was a leper. I learned later from the security logs at the Fairmont Hotel what had happened after the police took Richard and Sienna away. Beatrice had tried to leave. She walked out to the valet stand, head held high, pretending that this was all a misunderstanding. She handed the valet her ticket. The valet, a young man who had likely seen the news alert on his phone, looked at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. "I am sorry, Mrs. Vance," he had said. "We have been instructed by the leasing company to hold the vehicle. It has been reported as part of a forfeiture order." "That is ridiculous," she had snapped, reaching for her purse. "I will call a car service. Uber Black." She pulled out her phone. She opened the app. But when she tried to request a ride, the screen flashed a red notification, "Payment method declined." She tried her credit card. Declined. She tried the debit card linked to the joint account. Card frozen by federal order. Beatrice Vance, a woman who had not carried cash since 1995, was standing on the curb in a $5,000 dress with zero purchasing power. She began to panic. She called her friends. She called the women she lunched with, the women she sat with on charity boards, the women she had gossiped with about my failures. "Diane, darling, it is Beatrice. Yes, a terrible mix-up. Can you send a car? I am stranded." Click. "Margaret, please, I just need a ride to the club." Click. "Susan, hello." Voicemail. She stood there for 2 hours. The sun went down. The fog rolled in. The hotel management eventually asked her to leave the premises because the paparazzi were blocking the driveway. She had to walk. Beatrice Vance, walking in heels down the steep hills of San Francisco, alone, while the city she thought she owned turned its back on her. She ended up at the gates of Vance Manor. She did not have a key. She pressed the intercom button repeatedly, her desperate voice crackling through the speaker system in the library where I stood. "Elara, Elara, let me in. It is cold. I am your mother." I looked at the monitor. I saw her shivering, her makeup smeared, her perfect hair ruined by the wind. A part of me, The part that was still a frightened child, wanted to press the button, but then I remembered the day they changed the locks on my apartment. I remembered her laugh when Richard said I needed to learn a lesson about the real world. I did not answer. I turned off the monitor. She was learning her lesson. The night passed in silence. I slept in Grandma's room, on the small cot she used when her back hurt, surrounded by her books. The next morning brought the storm. Sienna had made bail. It was a miracle of legal maneuvering, likely paid for by a bail bondsman who took her jewelry as collateral since her accounts were frozen. She was out, but she was not free. Her passport had been surrendered. She was wearing an ankle monitor, and she was furious. I was in the garden, inspecting the damage they had done to the rose bushes in preparation for their helipad, when I heard the screech of tires. A taxi slammed on its brakes at the front gate. Sienna stormed out. She was wearing the same clothes she had been arrested in, a wrinkled designer tracksuit that now looked like a costume. She ran to the gate, grabbing the iron bars and shaking them. "Open this gate," she screamed. "Open it. Ilara, this is my house. Grandma left it to me." I walked slowly down the driveway. The gravel crunched under my boots. I stopped 10 feet from the gate. The iron bars separated us, one sister free, one sister trapped in a prison of her own making. "The deed says otherwise." "Sienna," I said calmly, "and the 3 banks holding your defaulted mortgages agree with me." "You tricked us!" she shrieked, her face blotchy and red. "You knew about the debt. You let us sign those papers. You set us up." "I let you sign what you demanded to sign," I corrected her. "You wanted the assets. You got them. You just didn't bother to read the balance sheet." "I need money," she demanded, changing tactics. "I have legal fees. The lawyers want a retainer. Give me access to the Veritas accounts. Just 50,000. I will pay you back when Lumina goes public." I stared at her. She was delusional. She still believed the lie. "Lumina is never going public, Sienna," I said. "It is over. The SEC shut down your servers this morning. The Wired article just dropped an hour ago. They interviewed your lead engineer. He admitted the biochip was a piece of plastic he bought on Alibaba." "He is a liar," she spat. "I am a visionary. You are just a dusty librarian. You are a failure. You live in the past." "You always said that," I nodded. "You said I was a failure because I lived in the past, because I cared about old books and dead history." I reached into my pocket. "But here is the thing about the past, Sienna. It is solid. It is real. It is built on facts, on documents, on things that have stood the test of time." I stepped closer to the gate. "Your future, your vision. It was just vapor. It was a story you told to get money, and when the money ran out, the story ended." "I hate you," she hissed. "I hope you rot in this house with the ghosts." "I am not rotting," I said. "I am restoring." I pulled my hand through the bars. I held out the single, crisp $1 bill I had retrieved from Richard's pocket before he was taken away. I had smoothed it out. "Here," I said. Sienna looked at the bill. "What is that?" "It is your inheritance," I said. "Sterling gave it to Dad, but I think you need it more. It is the only clean dollar the Vance family has left. It is the only thing you own that isn't built on fraud." She slapped my hand. The bill fluttered to the ground, landing in the dirt outside the gate. "I do not want your charity," she screamed. "It is not charity," I said, turning my back on her. "It is a reality check. Don't spend it all in one place." I walked back toward the house. Behind me, I heard her screaming, rattling the gates, a impotent rage against the iron reality of her situation. Eventually, she stopped. I looked back once. I saw her kneel down in the dirt. She picked up the dollar bill. She dusted it off, and then she walked away, head down, clutching the single dollar that represented the sum total of her life's work. I went back inside. I turned on the television in the den. The news was everywhere. Vance Empire collapse. The headline screamed in red letters. The news anchor was detailing the extent of the fraud. It was worse than I had imagined. Richard had not just embezzled from the charity. He had been running a Ponzi scheme with his hedge fund for 5 years, paying off old investors with new money from the loans he took out against the manor. He had destroyed the savings of hundreds of people, but the real bombshell came at the end of the broadcast. "And in a breaking development," the anchor said, pressing a finger to her earpiece, "Dr. Marcus Thorne, the personal physician to the late Eleanor Vance, has surrendered to authorities this morning." My heart skipped a beat. Thorne, the man who had signed the competency papers. "Sources say Dr. Thorne is cooperating with the district attorney in exchange for a plea deal," the reporter continued. "He has provided digital evidence texts and voice memos alleging that Richard Vance threatened to revoke his medical license and expose his gambling debts if he did not falsify Eleanor Vance's medical records." I sat down on the sofa. This was it. This was the final nail. Richard had claimed he was just a bad businessman, that the fraud was negligence, not malice, but extortion, threatening a doctor to declare a dying woman competent just long enough to rob her, and then incompetent immediately after. That was predatory. That showed intent. That was the kind of crime that carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The twisting of the knife was complete. My phone rang. It was Mr. Abernathy, the gardener. I had hired him back immediately, doubling his salary from the Veritas accounts. "Miss Alara," his gruff voice came over the line. "I am at the gate. I see well. I see your mother is sitting on the curb down the street. She looks in a bad way. Do you want me to drive her somewhere?" I looked out the window. The fog was lifting, revealing the golden light of the afternoon sun hitting the rose garden. I thought about the dollar bill in Sienna's hand. I thought about the prison cell waiting for my father. "No, Mr. Abernathy," I said quietly. "She has legs. Let her walk. She needs to learn how the rest of the world navigates the distance between ruin and redemption." I hung up. I picked up the old book one last time. I closed it. The restoration was finished. The spine was strong again. The pages were clean. The story of the Vance family had been a tragedy written by greed, but I had torn out the last chapter, and now, with a house full of silence and a heart full of memory, I was ready to write a new one. The week following the revelation at the hotel was not a time of rest. It was a time of excision, if Vance Manor was a body. My parents and sister had been a cancer, spreading their malignant taste and toxic debt into every room. Now, as the sole owner of Veritas Archives, and by extension, the manor itself, I had to perform the surgery. I did not do it with a scalpel, but with an auction gavel. I hired a liquidation firm to clear the house of everything Richard and Beatrice had purchased in the last 10 years. It was a purge of the gaudy, the overpriced, and the soulless. The crystal chandelier in the foyer, a monstrosity that looked like a frozen explosion and cost $40,000, was the first to go. Then came the custom Italian leather sofas that were too uncomfortable to sit on. Then the silk drapes that blocked out the sunlight Grandma loved so much. Trucks lined up the driveway, hauling away the physical manifestations of their ego. The proceeds from this fire sale were substantial. I did not keep a penny of it. I directed the liquidation team to wire every single dollar into a new account, the Eleanor Vance Scholarship for Historical Preservation. It was poetic justice. The money Richard had spent to impress his friends would now pay for students to learn how to save the very history he had tried to throw in the trash. Amidst the chaos of movers and appraisers, I found Mr. Abernathy in the greenhouse. The old gardener was packing a cardboard box with his trowels and pruning shears. He looked defeated, a man who had given his life to a patch of earth that he believed was no longer his to tend. "Mr. Abernathy," I said, stepping into the humid warmth of the glass room. "What are you doing?" He looked up, startling slightly. He pulled his cap off his head, his fingers nervously working the brim. "Miss Alara, I assumed with the new ownership and the bankruptcy I am just clearing out my personal effects. I do not want to be in the way. Put the tools back, I said gently. It is all right, miss, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. I am 72. It is probably time I retired anyway, though with the pension gone. He trailed off, the reality of his financial ruin hanging in the air. The pension is not gone, I said. Veritas Archives assumed all liabilities of the estate. Remember, that includes the staff pensions. I restored your fund this morning, plus interest. He froze. He looked at me with watery eyes, unable to process the reprieve. You did. I did. I smiled. But I cannot let you retire. I have a problem. You see, I am going to be very busy running the Preservation Trust. I need someone to manage the estate, not just the garden, but the house, the grounds, everything. I need an estate manager, someone who actually loves this place. You want me, he stammered. I am offering you a contract for life, Mr. Abernathy, I said, stepping forward and taking his rough hand. Double your previous salary, full benefits, and you answer only to me. No more parties, no more helipads, just the roses. The old man broke down. He did not say a word. He just gripped my hand and nodded, tears tracking through the dirt on his cheeks. In that moment, the house ceased to be a battlefield and started to feel like a home again, but the ghosts were not done haunting me. 2 days later, they appeared. I was in the study, organizing Grandma's original journals. When the intercom buzzed, it was Mr. Abernathy. Miss Alara? His voice was tight. They are here, at the front door. They say they just want to talk. I knew who they were without asking. I walked to the front door. I opened it. Richard and Beatrice Vance stood on the doorstep. The transformation was shocking. It had only been a week, yet they looked as if they had aged a decade. Richard was unshaven, wearing a sweater that had a stain on the collar. He looked smaller, deflated, stripped of the arrogance that had been his armor. Beatrice was pale, her hair pulled back in a messy clip, her eyes darting nervously around the porch she used to command. Elara, Beatrice breathed, stepping forward. She tried to smile, but it was a grimace. Thank God you are home. This is not your home, I said, standing in the doorway, blocking their entry. You have been evicted. Please, Richard said, his voice raspy. We have nowhere to go. The banks took the penthouse. They took the cars. We are staying in a motel in Daly City. A motel, Elara, with cockroaches. It is a hard fall, I agreed, leaning against the doorframe. What do you want? We are family, Beatrice pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. We raised you. We fed you. We gave you everything. You cannot just leave us on the street. We know we made mistakes. We were stressed. The business made us do things we did not mean. We can help you run the estate, Richard added, a flash of his old scheming returning to his eyes. You need experience. You need someone who understands finance. We can be consultants. Just give us the guest cottage. We will stay out of your way. I looked at them. I looked at the people who had brought me into the world and then spent 34 years making me feel like I was taking up too much space in it. They were trying to gaslight me one last time. They were trying to rewrite history, to paint themselves as victims of circumstance and me as the ungrateful daughter who owed them salvation. You gave me everything, I repeated softly. Yes, Beatrice nodded eagerly. Private schools, clothes, a roof over your head. I remember my 10th birthday, I said. The memory was so sharp it felt like I could touch it. I had a fever of 104. I told them. I was hallucinating. The nanny called you. You were at a gala for the opera. Do you remember what you said? Beatrice blinked, confused. Elara, that was 20 years ago. You told the nanny not to bother you unless I stopped breathing, I said, my voice cold and steady. You said my fever was attention-seeking behavior. You did not come home until noon the next day. And when you walked into my room, you did not check my forehead. You checked the stock ticker on the television. Richard shifted uncomfortably. We were busy, We were building a future for you. No, I corrected him. You were building a mirror for yourselves. You called me a stain. You called me a failure. You tried to institutionalize your own mother to buy a yacht. We were desperate, Richard shouted, his facade cracking. Do you know what it is like to lose everything, to have people laugh at you? I do, I said. Because you made me live that way my entire life. You made me the joke of the family. I stepped out onto the porch, forcing them to back down the steps. The greatest revenge isn't hating you. I told them, hate takes energy. Hate implies that I still care what you think. My revenge is that I no longer need your validation to exist. I am not Alara the failure. I am Alara Vance, the owner of this house, and you are trespassing, you ungrateful witch. Beatrice screamed, her face twisting into ugliness. I hope you die alone in this house. I am not alone, I said, looking over at the garden where Mr. Abernathy was waving from the rose bushes. I have the people who actually care. I closed the door in their faces. I heard Richard pounding on the wood, shouting threats, but I engaged the deadbolt. The sound faded as they were escorted off the property by the private security firm I had hired to replace the gate codes. I went back to the study. I felt light. The cord was finally cut, but the final purge was not yet complete. There was one last secret the house was holding. I had ordered the removal of Richard's massive safe from the wall of the study. The movers had pulled it out, but they couldn't open it. Richard had refused to give up the combination to the FBI, claiming it contained privileged personal correspondence. I did not need his combination. I had Grandma's book. On the last page of the hidden section, she had written a series of numbers under the heading Richard's Vanity. It was his own birthday. Followed by the date he made his first million, I spun the dial. Right to 1965. Left to 1998. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. The safe was mostly empty. He had cleared out the cash and the jewelry before the funeral, but at the very back, taped to the underside of the top shelf, was a manila envelope. I pulled it out. It was addressed to a man named Mr. V. I opened it. Inside was a single letter, typed on a typewriter to avoid digital tracing, and a stack of cash, $10,000 in hundreds. I read the letter. My blood turned to ice. Regarding the obstacle EV, if the subject contests the will or attempts to interfere with the transfer of assets on the 28th, proceed with option B, accidental overdose preferred. History of depression can be leveraged. Payment enclosed. I stared at the paper. Option B. They had not just planned to ruin me. They had not just planned to leave me homeless. My father, the man whose DNA I shared, had set aside $10,000 to have me killed if I became too much of a nuisance. He was going to stage it as a suicide. The depressed failure who couldn't handle the rejection. It was the perfect narrative closure. I did not scream. I did not cry. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. This was why he had been so desperate at the funeral. He wasn't just afraid of bankruptcy. He was afraid of a murder charge. I picked up the phone. I did not call the police. I called the district attorney directly. Harrison Sterling had given me his private number. Mr. District Attorney, I said when he answered. This is Alara Vance. I have something you need to see. It concerns the sentencing hearing. The trial was swift, with the financial fraud, the Ponzi scheme, and the medical extortion of Dr. Thorne. Richard and Sienna were already looking at significant time, but the letter changed everything. It moved the case from white-collar crime to conspiracy to commit capital murder. The doctor, terrified of being implicated in a murder plot, turned full witness. He testified that Richard had asked him about lethal dosages of insulin a week before the funeral. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing. I sat in the front row, wearing a suit of sharp, tailored navy blue. I looked Richard in the eye. He looked away. He was a broken man, hunched and shivering. Sienna sat beside him, weeping silently. The judge was a stern woman who had no patience for the tears of the privileged. "Richard Vance," she said, her voice echoing in the chamber. "Your greed was boundless, but your cruelty was calculating. You preyed on strangers. You preyed on your mother, and you conspired to end the life of your own daughter for financial gain. Richard flinched. For the counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. 15 years. He would be 80 years old when he got out, if he got out. Sienna Vance, the judge continued, you were a willing participant in a massive fraud. You sold a lie to the world and mocked the victims. For securities fraud and grand larceny, I sentence you to 8 years. Sienna wailed. It was a high, thin sound of a child who realizes the timeout is real. I stood up. I did not stay to hear their pleas. I walked out of the courtroom, past the cameras that were no longer interested in Sienna's outfit, but in her handcuffs. I walked out into the sunlight. The air tasted sweet. It tasted like justice. I hailed a taxi. Where to? The driver asked. Vance Manor, I said. Then I corrected myself. No, take me to the Veritas Library. The purge was over. The cancer was cut out. The house was clean, and for the first time in 34 years, I was not looking over my shoulder. I was looking ahead. 1 year is a long time in the life of a city, but it is barely a heartbeat in the life of a house. For decades, Vance Manor had stood on the hill like a brooding gargoyle, its iron gates locked tight against the world, guarding secrets and hollow ambitions. It had been a place where silence was enforced and warmth was a liability. But today, as I stood on the balcony overlooking the driveway, the silence was gone. It had been replaced by a sound that my father would have hated and my grandmother would have loved. The sound of curiosity. The gates were wide open. A yellow school bus was idling by the fountain, which was no longer dry but bubbling with clean water. A line of fourth graders was filing up the stone steps, their chatter echoing off the limestone walls. They were not here to marvel at the wealth of a billionaire. They were here to visit the Veritas Public Library and Museum of History. I walked down the stone steps into the rose garden. Mr. Abernathy had outdone himself. The bushes, which had been slated for demolition to make room for a helipad, were now exploding with color, deep crimsons, soft pinks, and the rare white heritage roses that Grandma had planted 50 years ago. They had survived the neglect. They had survived the threat of pavement. They had simply waited for the season to turn. They are showing off today, Miss Alara. Mr. Abernathy said, looking up from a bed of soil. He looked 10 years younger than he had on the day of the funeral. He was wearing a uniform with the Veritas logo on the pocket. They know they are safe, I replied, touching a velvety petal. That makes all the difference. Safety was a luxury I was still learning to accept. For the first 6 months after the trial, I had woken up every morning expecting to find a foreclosure notice on the door or a subpoena in the mail. I expected the other shoe to drop, but the only thing that dropped was the gavel of justice. Richard was currently serving the first year of his 15-year sentence in a federal facility in Nevada. I did not visit. I received updates from the prison warden, mostly regarding his health, which was declining, and his constant attempts to file appeals that were summarily rejected. He was a man shouting into a void he had created. Sienna was in a minimum security facility in Dublin, California. The report said she was working in the prison library. I found a dark, ironic humor in that. She was finally learning how to organize books, a skill she had mocked me for all my life. She had written me once, asking for money to buy commissary items. I had returned the letter unopened, but then there was Beatrice. I left the garden and walked into my office, the room that used to be Richard's study. It was unrecognizable now. The heavy, dark curtains were gone, replaced by sheer linen that let the California sun flood the room. The smell of cigars and stale scotch was replaced by the scent of beeswax and old paper. On my desk sat a letter. It had arrived that morning. The handwriting was familiar, though shakier than I remembered. It was from my mother. She was not in prison. She was in a purgatory of her own making. Beatrice was currently living in a subsidized studio apartment in the Tenderloin district, a far cry from the gated community she had ruled. She was working 30 hours a week at a laundromat, folding sheets for $3 above minimum wage. I picked up the letter. I did not need to open it to know what it said. It would be a mix of guilt-tripping and desperation. She would talk about her arthritis. She would mention how the other women at the laundromat did not understand her refinement. She would ask, in a roundabout way, for a loan. Just a few thousand. Just until she got back on her feet. I held the envelope over the trash can. My hand hovered there. I could crush her. I could leave her to drown in the reality she had ignored while she was buying diamond chokers with stolen charity money. It would be fair. It would be justice. But then I looked at the portrait of Grandma Eleanor hanging above the fireplace. She looked stern, but her eyes were kind. She had been tough, but she had never been cruel. I put the letter down. I picked up the phone and dialed Harrison Sterling. "Elara," the lawyer answered. "Is everything all right with the board meeting preparations?" "The meeting is fine," I said, my voice steady. "I have a different instruction. Regarding Beatrice Vance." Sterling paused. "Has she been harassing you again? I can file a restraining order." "No," I said. "I want you to contact the landlord of her building, the subsidized one." "Okay, to evict her." "No," I said, looking out at the rose garden. "I want you to pay her rent, for the next year, in full." There was a long silence on the other end. "Elara, after everything she did, she watched them lock you out of your home. She tried to gaslight you into giving up your inheritance." "I know," I said, "and that is why I am doing it, because if I let her starve, or if I let her end up on the street, I become her. I become the person who uses money as a weapon. I am not doing this for her. Sterling, I am doing it for me. I need to know that I am different." "Understood," Sterling said, his tone softening. "Do you want her to know it is from you?" "Absolutely not," I commanded. "Tell her it is an anonymous grant from a housing charity. If she knows it is from me, she will think she has a foothold. She will think she can manipulate me again. She gets the roof over her head, but she does not get access to my life. That door is closed forever." "Done," Sterling said. "You are a better woman than she deserves." "I am just my grandmother's granddaughter," I said, and hung up. I sat back in my chair. It was a small act, but it felt like releasing a heavy stone I had been carrying. I was not forgiving her. I was simply refusing to carry the weight of her suffering. I turned my chair to look at the wall behind my desk. There, in a simple black frame, hung a single object, $1. The bill was wrinkled. It had a smudge of dirt on the corner from where Sienna had thrown it on the ground. It was not a fortune. It was not a treasure. But to me, it was the most valuable thing in the entire estate. That dollar represented the moment the spell broke. It was the moment I realized that their value system was a lie. They had chased millions and ended up with nothing. I had accepted $1 and ended up with everything. It was a reminder that freedom is not about how much you have, but about how much you are willing to let go of. I stood up and walked over to the bookshelf. I pulled down the small, battered book from the first night. The book Grandma had handed me at the party. The one my parents had thrown in the trash. I had fully restored it now. The leather was supple, the binding tight. I opened it to the very last page. I ran my finger over the purple ink. Tracing the shaky line of Grandma's handwriting, I had read it 1,000 times, but today, it felt different. Failure is just what the world calls things that have not yet had their time to shine. "I am shining on me, Grandma," I whispered to the empty room. I closed the book. My assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Vance, the ceremony is starting. The committee is waiting." I took a deep breath. Today was the day I was receiving the National Cultural Preservation Award. It was the highest honor in my field. But more importantly, the award was being given to Elara Vance, not the Vance heiress, not the girl who sued her parents, just Elara, the historian, the preservationist. "I am coming," I said. I picked up a checkbook from my desk. Before I left the room, I had one last piece of business to conclude: the liquidation of my parents' assets, the cars, the furs, the jewelry. The hideous furniture had raised nearly $3 million. It was a significant sum. Technically, it was mine. I could have bought a villa in France. I could have bought a yacht. But that money felt heavy. It felt like it was covered in the same slime that had coated the family for years. I wrote out a check for the full amount, $3,420,000. I made it payable to the Second Chance Legal Defense Fund, a charity that provided legal representation for victims of financial abuse and elder fraud. I signed my name. The ink dried quickly. I tore the check out of the book and placed it in an envelope. I was not keeping the profit of their greed. I was using it to ensure that other people like Grandma, and other people like me, had a fighting chance against the vultures of the world. I walked out of the office, down the hallway lined with restored tapestries and display cases filled with the true history of the region. I walked past the portrait of my grandfather, who had built the house, and my grandmother, who had saved it. I walked out the front doors of Veritas Library. The sun hit my face. It was blindingly bright, a pure white light that washed out the shadows of the past. The air smelled of eucalyptus and ocean salt. At the bottom of the stairs, a crowd was gathered. There were reporters, yes, but they were respectful now. There were city officials, there were students, and there was Mr. Abernathy, standing in the back, giving me a thumbs up. I paused at the top of the stairs. I looked at the horizon, where the city of San Francisco glittered like a jewel. I thought about the scared girl who used to hide in the basement, gluing broken pages together. I thought about the woman who had stood on a stage and brought down an empire with a single sentence. I was neither of them anymore. I was something new. I was whole. I adjusted the book in my hand. I stepped forward, descending the stairs not as a victim and not as a conqueror, but as a keeper of the truth. I had written the end of their story. Now, I was writing the beginning of mine, and that is how I turned $1 into eternal freedom. Do not ever let anyone appraise your human worth, especially when they only know how to count currency and not compassion. If you like this ending, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Justice sometimes arrives late, but it is always sweet. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening on your commute, at work, or relaxing at home? Please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. Don't forget to subscribe to BitterSweet Drama Stories. Like this video, and if you really enjoyed it, hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.